And particularly this morning, we begin by looking at topic number 3. Topic number 3 is going to introduce you to cascading style sheets. So it's an introduction to cascading style sheets. So we are going to cover what is CSS and why. Why do we need the CSS? Why do we need it? Then we're going to look at the several ways in which you can apply CSS in your HTML pages, particularly inline, embedded, and external style sheets. So we're going to understand the difference between those. We're also going to have an overview of CSS selectors, properties, and values, efficient CSS, how to validate CSS, and some developer tools. So those are some of the things that we're going to be looking at. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to. Vincent, you can read this out to us.
The learning out. Yeah, by the end of this topic, students will be able to discuss the role of CSS in developing web pages. Second, create style sheet rules, a variety of selectors and properties. Then describe the advantages and disadvantages of embedded and inline style sheets.
Yes.
And then finally, explain the need for organized style sheets.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Vincent. Okay, so CSS in full is cascading style sheets. It's also a scripting language. So while HTML is used to describe the structure of a document, that is, which part is a heading, which part is a paragraph, which part is a list, which part is a table, which part is an image, which part is a menu, etc. Cascading style sheets, on the other hand, are used to specify the presentation of web pages. So the presentation really is the outlook. CSS simplifies site updates. Developers can just modify the styles to change the web page's look. So a style is a rule. A style is a rule that describes how the specific part of a web page is formatted. So formatting. That is what we call the outlook. So style sheet is a set of style rules. A style sheet is a set of style rules, meaning we have a number of style rules in a style sheet. A single CSS document is called a style sheet. It's called a style sheet. So really, with CSS, then you're able to format your web page just like you will do format your Word document. So you can change things like font, the font color, the font face, the font size. You can be able, for example, to change the line spacing or even the spaces between paragraphs or different parts of your web page, background color, text or foreground color. You can be able to even place things on different parts of your web page, what we call floating or positioning. So those are some of the things you can do with CSS. But even more, you can actually be able to animate your web page using CSS. And we're going to be looking at some of those things that I've just mentioned. Now, how does CSS work? So when you view a page like this one, so this is just a sample HTML page. Of course, we have the other tags that we've not included. We just have two tags here, block level tags. So we have the H1 and we have the P. So when you run this page, then the browser will apply the default settings to these page elements. So default settings, for example, usually the text is going to be color black or something, and then font size, maybe font size 12, font face maybe Times New Roman. So we have a certain default. So even without including CSS, your page is going to have those particular formatting. Now, using CSS, we can be able to specify how we want this document to look. That means that we will, for example, specify that we want all our heading ones maybe to be colored red. For example, we want all our paragraphs to be colored blue. So those are some kind of formatting that we want. And in fact, we can even say that anytime we have an M inside a H1, we want that particular text to have a background color, for example, of black. But if we have an M inside a paragraph, we want it to have a background color, for example, of, let's say, for example, white or something. So you can be able to specify those specifics using CSS. Now, there are different parts of the CSS code that you must understand. Now, this one is an example. Now, CSS style sheets are made up of one or more style rules. As we said, a sheet is a single CSS page. Now, these particular style rules have three specific things that you need to know. The first one is called a selector. So, for example, here, H1 is a selector. Now, the selector is used to specify the particular part of your HTML document that is going to be affected. So, for example, here, this selector means that we are selecting all heading ones. Anywhere where we have the heading 1 tag is going to be affected using these properties. Now, after the selector, you have to use an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket. Then after that, you have what we call properties. So, color is a property. Letter spacing is a property. Then, after the property, you have a full colon. Then you have the value. So, each property must have a value. Then after the value, you have a semicolon. Now, generally, the next property should actually start from a new line. So, in CSS, really, how we will do this, let me just write it. So, we will write something like H1, then opening colon. And normally, I won't be able to go back. I can't be able to move my cursor back, so I won't be able to type. I won't be able to type the opening and the closing curly bracket. But when I begin typing on the editor that we're supposed to be using to type this code, I'll be typing the opening and the closing curly bracket. Then I come back inside those two in order to be able to write the properties. So normally, of course, just like in any other programming language, anywhere we have a block, we normally indent the code to make it more readable and just to show that it's within that particular block. So, for example, one of the properties might be color. So we can say color, for example, blue, like that. Then we end that with a semicolon. So the next property should be on the next line like that. So, for example, letter spacing, full colon, space. Then, for example, we want to have 5 pixels. Then semicolon. Then when we are done with that, then we do that. So generally here, as we said, this is called a selector. Color here is the property. Letter spacing, also another property. So we are going to learn a number of CSS properties. Now, after the property, then normally you have the full colon. Then you have the value, for example, blue. Then at the end of every statement, we terminate it with a semicolon. Then the next property comes on the next line. One other thing I might say here is that anytime a property has more than one word, is made up of more than one word, like letter spacing, then we normally separate it with a hyphen. So what will this do? This will ensure that all heading 1s are colored blue, and the spaces between the letters of all heading 1s is going to be 5 pixels. So that is what that particular code will achieve. So please don't forget that for every CSS rule, we have a selector, we have the property, and we have the value. Okay, so let's move on. Now, we can apply CSS in our HTML pages in one of 3 ways. The first one is called External Stylesheet. The next one is called Embedded. And lastly, we have Inline. So we want to look at each one of them and understand the difference. Now, with the External Stylesheet, we normally write this on a separate document. So we write the rules on a separate document, and we save that document with the extension .css. So for example, stylesheet.css, a certain name, then .css. So that is what we call an external stylesheet. So how do we include this particular separate document in our HTML, page? We use what we call the link element. The link element is an empty element, or you can also call it a standalone element. Normally, we include the link element inside the head element of our HTML page. You remember where the title was? So just after the title, then we can have the link. We can have the link element. So as you can see here, this particular selector, we've saved it in this file called, for example, style.css. So in our HTML page, we can use the link element. The link element has the following compulsory attributes. One of them is href. So href then is equals to the value style.css. So href is used to specify the file name and location of the CSS file. The file name and location of the CSS file. So if the location is, if they're on the same folder as this HTML page, then we simply write the name and the extension, like what is happening here. Otherwise, we also have what we call the type attribute. The type attribute is used to specify that this is a CSS page, and the rel attribute means that this is a style sheet. So you should always include these 3 attributes: href, rel, and type. So always remember that. So that is how we link the style sheet to our HTML document. Okay. Now, the next way in which we can include or apply CSS to our HTML page is by using embedded CSS. Normally, embedded CSS is used by using the style tag. The style tag is a normal tag with an opening and a closing tag. Then in between the style tag, you can be able to include your rules. You can be able to type in your rules. Now, generally, just like the link element, the style tag goes in between the head element, as you can see. So opening head, then closing head. So it goes in between the head element. So it must be placed, as you can see, it must be placed in the head element of the document. So really, that is what we call embedded CSS. And lastly, we have inline. We have inline CSS. Now, with inline CSS, you use the style attribute in a particular element in order to affect the content of that particular element. So this is a good example of an inline. So you see, we are inside the h1 element. So we use the style attribute, and we include some properties and values. So when we do this, then this particular heading 1 is going to be colored blue, and the spaces between the letters is going to be 5 pixels. So that is what we call inline CSS. So inline CSS only affects that particular element, and really it is rarely used because it can be tedious to use. when it comes to applying styles to your HTML pages. Now, you need to understand the difference between these three methods and when to use each one of them. Now, generally, all your style configuration is going to be in a single or more than one external file. So most of the time you're going to be using external CSS. This is the best way to style a website. Why do we say so? Because when you use a single file, then you can be able to apply it. You can be able to apply it in all the pages, in all the web pages you have in your document. Remember, you're going to have so many web pages: contact us, about us, home, gallery. So in all these pages, you want to include this single external file so that it can format all your heading ones in a similar manner. So that's why we say that you must have an external CSS, and it's actually the best way to implement it. The disadvantage of external is that sometimes it can get so large, as you might have guessed already, because you're including all your CSS there. So it can get very large, and that one there. Okay. The second one is embedded CSS. Embedded CSS. Embedded CSS can be used to define style rules that only apply to a single page. Normally, it's included in the head using the style tag or style element. Now, this one, the advantage is that it reduces the number of rules in the external CSS. Now, anytime you have a style that you want to apply only on a particular page and not on all the other pages, then you can do this by using embedded CSS. For example, you have just a specific formatting for your gallery that you may not need in all the other pages. So in such cases, then just put it as an embedded CSS within the head of that gallery page using the style element. Then the last one is inline CSS. This one is rarely used. Why? Because you cannot reuse inline CSS. You remember we said that with external CSS you can reuse it in all the other pages. You simply include it using the link. But with inline, you cannot even use it in more than one element. You only use it on a single element where you've used it. So that's the problem with inline. And the other problem with it is that it becomes very tedious to update the design of the website, because you have to change the CSS in each element where you've included the inline CSS. So those are the two disadvantages of inline CSS, and that's why it's rarely used. Now you might ask, what happens if we have different rules for the same element? We have different rules for the same element, one external, maybe one embedded, and one inline. What happens? Which rule is going to be applied for that particular element? Now, browsers obey the most recently read CSS, and normally the most recently read CSS will be inline CSS. So for example, if in your external CSS you said H1s should be colored blue, then in that H1 you've included an inline CSS and you've said the color should be red, then that paragraph is not going to be colored blue, but instead it's going to be colored red. So that is what we call the cascade. If you have more than one rule on the different implementations or applications of CSS, then the most recently read, which is inline, is going to be applied. If you have external and embedded only, then embedded is going to be applied first before external. Okay, so a few tricks here when it comes to using selectors. Just as a reminder, we said the selector is used to select particular part of your HTML document which is going to be affected by the CSS. So, for example, we can have the H1 selector to select your heading ones. You can have the P selector to select your paragraphs. Now, if you have a scenario like this one, where your H1s, you want them to be colored red, your paragraphs, you also want them to be colored red, then that is a good recipe to group these two selectors, because you want the same color for both the headings and the paragraphs. So how do you group selectors? This is how you do it. So H1, then comma, space, P. Then you simply open the curly bracket, you close it, then the property and the value red. So that is how we group selectors. And this also helps to ensure that especially our external CSS files do not grow to be so huge and wildly. Okay, so that is what we call grouping selectors. So anytime you have similar values for several selectors, you group them by using a comma and a space. H1, comma, space, P. So that's how we group selectors. Okay. The other trick you can use is by using what we call the universal selector. Anytime you use an asterisk, this one, an asterisk, it simply says select all the tags in my HTML document. So if you want to apply a style to every element, then you use the asterisks. So it's used to select all elements. So when you do this, then you say background color white, then text align right, then for all your elements within the body tag of your document, they're going to have a background color of white, and the text is going to be aligned on the right. Just as a reminder, again, I said that anytime a property has is made up of more than one word, we separate it using a hyphen. Okay, now let's look at selector inheritance. Another very interesting concept. Now, by default, nested elements inherit style values. Now, look here. When we say that the body should have a color of blue. So, any tag that comes inside the body, any other element that comes inside the body is going to have a color of blue. It's going to have a color of blue unless it has been specified otherwise. Unless, for example, we say H1, we want it to be red. So even though H1 is inside the body, it's going now to be colored red. So that is what we call inheritance. That if you nest an element inside another element, it's going to inherit the characteristics of that particular element. So, for example, you can also see here, we have the paragraph tag, and inside the paragraph tag, we've nested the M tag. So if we've said that we want our paragraphs to be color blue, then this particular value is also going to be color blue. If we've not specified that M should be any other color, then the M inside a paragraph is also going to be color blue. So that is what we call inheritance. That when you put tags inside other tags, they inherit the properties of the parent. Okay. Then we also have what we call descendant selectors. So these are used to select elements that are nested within another specific element. Now, how we do this is we do, for example, the P selector for paragraph, then space, then M. So here what we are saying is, anytime we have an M inside a paragraph, we want it to be colored red. So in this particular example, then this value CSS will be colored red. Even though, for example, the paragraph will be colored blue, but every time we have an M inside a paragraph, we will color it red. So that is what we call descendant selectors. Descendant selectors. Okay. Anyone with a question so far? Question or comment? Hello, can you still hear me?
I think we are good.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, we can get you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, then let's look at the concept of pseudo elements. Pseudo elements. Pseudo elements. A pseudo element is used to. Pseudo elements are parts of elements. Parts of elements. For example, the first line or the first letter of an element. Part of an element. Pseudo elements can actually be used even to select the odd or even rows of a table. So they don't select the entire element but part of an element. Now we have a good example here. We have P, then colon, colon, then first letter. So this is a good example of a pseudo element. Now this particular pseudo element ensures that for every paragraph, the first letter should have a font size of 24 points and will be colored red. So that is what we call a pseudo element. It doesn't select the entire paragraph, but a part of that paragraph. Specifically for this example, it selects the first letter of this paragraph. So that's what we call a pseudo element. Now we have two very important selectors that you should never forget because you're going to be using them to make your work easier. The first one is called a class selector. A class selector. The next one is called an ID selector. Now, normally, you use a class selector when you want to specify properties that are going to be applied to several elements. Properties that you want to be applied to several elements. On the other hand, the next kind of selector, which is called the ID selector, anytime we have ID, you know it's unique. So the ID selector normally used to specify styles that you want to apply to a particular element that will have that ID. So class selector when you want to apply these properties on different elements. ID selector on a specific element. Okay, so let's see how this is done. So the class attribute can be applied to nearly any element. It allows us to label related parts of an HTML document. So in this particular example, the first and last paragraphs have been given a class of negative. Now, we can name our classes anything we like, but it is advisable that the name should be meaningful. Okay, so let's see how we use the class selector in our HTML document. So for example, to include a class selector, you have to include it as an attribute. So the attribute name is class. Then of course the equal sign, double quotation marks, then the name of the class. So you can see that this paragraph has that particular class negative. The second paragraph, it doesn't have a class. The third paragraph also has the class negative. Okay, so let's see. How do we create class negative in our CSS? How do we create class negative in our CSS? Okay, so normally we use the class selector. The class selector is a full stop. So normally you do the element name, then the full stop, then the class name. So for example, P, then the full stop, then the class name negative. So when we do this, any paragraph that will have class is equals to negative, they are going to have their text color is gonna be red. It's gonna be red. It's gonna be red. So here, this one will be colored red. This paragraph will be colored red. But this one here will probably have the default color black. And so, are you seeing how we use the class selector? So that's how we do use the class selector. The second one that is important is the ID selector. So the ID attribute uniquely identifies an element. This is how we include the ID attribute. ID is equals to welcome. So for this H1, ID is equals to welcome. So if we want to format this particular element H1 that is welcoming people to our website. So the title here is, the content here is welcome to Cascading Stylesheet. So this is the very first paragraph in our website, and we want to format it differently from all other H1s. Then we use the ID selector. Now, how do we specify the ID selector in CSS? You specify the ID selector using a hashtag. So we can use an ID selector hashtag to target individual elements based on their ID value. So you begin by doing the name of the selector, the name of the element rather, then the hashtag value, then the name of the ID value. So for example, for H1s, for the H1 that will have an ID value of welcome, we want the letter spacing to be 10 pixels. For all other H1s, we want the letter spacing to be 5 pixels, for example. So this will particularly apply just to this H1, So that's how we use the ID selector. And as you're going to see, normally we also use this a lot in forms. We use the ID selector in forms a lot. When you see, for example, that we have a text input, a form like that, then to show you, for example, that you're supposed to enter here, for example, your phone number, then you have a phone icon here. To show you that you're supposed to enter your email, we have an at icon here. So we normally do that using the ID selector. Okay. Also very interesting stuff. You're going to be using this a lot. Div and span. These two elements are... Yes?
I think we have a question in the chat.
Oh, please just ask because I can't see your chat. Just unmute your mic and ask.
Yeah. I think someone is asking, what's the need of doing H1 with an ID selector, and yet ID selectors are unique and not shared?
Hey, come up again. Sorry, I didn't hear you well. And I will leave that.
Sama, what is the need of doing H1 with an ID, and yet ID selectors are unique and not the need of doing H1 with an ID selector?
I don't know why I'm unable to hear you very well. Sawa. Hebu uliza tena nijaribu kusikia vizuri. What is the need?
What is the need of doing H1 with an ID selector? Having H1 then followed by the hashtag. And yet the ID selectors are not shared.
Oh, okay. So remember, this is in CSS. This is in HTML. So these are two different things. So in HTML, we say ID is equals to welcome. Now, in order to format H1s with an ID value of welcome, this is how we specify it in CSS. So this is in CSS. I don't know whether I've answered that question. So we have to specify it in CSS in order to target particularly this H1 that has an ID value of welcome, so that we can uniquely target that element. So this property, letter spacing 10 pixels, is only going to be applied to this paragraph, to this H1, not to any other H1. Is that clear?
Yes. What if also, is it also possible to maybe use the ID selector alone without the element tag?
Or without the element, like just hashtag welcome?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, you can be able to use it, but it's recommended that you also do the name of the element for your program to be more readable and for us to understand. So it becomes easier for people to be able to search for this. A H1 that has the ID of welcome. So it becomes easier for that. It's more readable and easier to understand than just hashtag welcome. But hashtag welcome will still work. Similarly,
I think that's good.
Okay. Similarly, for the class selector, you can also just do dot negative. So you don't have to do p dot negative. You can just dot negative. So both of them will work. Okay. So HTML5 introduced two new elements, the div and the span element. Now, div element is used to enclose block level, or really is a block level element. On the other hand, span element is an inline element. Of course, the main difference between block level and inline, block level will put a blank line before that particular element. That means that if you use div anywhere, it's going to begin from the next line. Inline element like span, it does not break, so it just continues on the same line. So that's the main difference between div and span. So we can specify meaning for these elements using the class and ID attributes. Div element is especially useful. We can nest any element we like, inside the div element. The div element is very important. In fact, it's the one that is used to lay out. It's the one that is used to lay out our page. Normally, websites are made up of rows and columns. So the different rows and columns, we normally create them using the div elements. So we say this div is going to be on the top. It's going to be on the top. It's going to occupy 100% of the width, and it's going to have a length of 20% of the web page. So that simply means, for example, if we want to create a box like this, for example, this one. So we use the div element, we give it an ID, then we specify that we want it to have this width. 100% means it's going to occupy the entire from left to right. Then we want it to be to have a width. We want it to have the other one is width, and then this one is length. We want it to occupy a length of 20% of the web page, for example. So normally we use div to do that. After that, for example, we can say we want another div. And that div, for example, should be occupying maybe 20% of the width, like that. 20% of the width. Then length, it should be, for example, the remaining 80%, because the first one here is occupying 20%. Then we can have another div here that will hold our contents. this div, for example, we can call it dashboard. It's occupying 80% width, and the length again is 80%. So normally we use divs. We use divs to create these different blocks in our web pages. Okay, so this one here is an example. Both the div and span elements are regularly used with the class and ID selectors. So this is just an example. So here we have a div. Here we have a div with the ID value of comments. So the div is ending here. You can see the div is ending here. So open div, close div. Normally, these paragraphs that are here should actually be indented. Anytime you are nesting block level elements, you indent for your code to be more readable. So in CSS, we're going to say div hashtag comments. Then we're going to say background color gray. So all these paragraphs, really, they're going to be inside this box that has a background color of gray. So I hope you've understood that. Okay, so let's look at some important CSS properties. The first kind of properties you need to understand are the text and font properties. Then we're also going to look at box properties, then list properties, then background images, then floating and positioning. Okay, so let's begin by CSS Text Properties. They provide many ways to control the appearance of text. Such properties include, but not limited to, color. We've already seen that. Line height. So line height is how tall do you want your text to be? How tall? Then text align. You've done this in Word. You can align text to the left, to the center, or to the right. So those are some of the values that might go here. So other than center, you can have right or left. Then text transform. If you want the text to be uppercase or lowercase or toggled case, so that is some of the values that can go there. Then text indent. So for this paragraph, you want the first line of this paragraph to be indented. You push it in so that it begins 100 pixels in. So that is what text indent is used to do. So those are some of the text properties. Under text properties, we still have font family. It is used to specify a list of fonts in order of preference. So browsers can only display fonts that are installed on the user's machine. It is important to insist at this particular point that don't use fancy fonts. Don't use fancy fonts that are not common, especially fonts that don't come with Microsoft Office Word. What happens is when you install Microsoft Office Word, for example, a list of fonts are installed on your computer. If you've tried doing designs, for example, in Photoshop or in Adobe, then you've most likely downloaded a fancy font from the internet. Now, if you download such a fancy font, then you use it while developing your website. What happens is when you host that website and people view it on their machines, if that fancy font is not installed in their machine, then it's going to be displayed using the default font. So do not use fancy fonts that are not common. Don't use fancy fonts that are not common. Don't use those fancy fonts. Okay, just a moment.
Excuse me, sir, you are breaking. We're not getting you clearly.
Okay, maybe it was because someone was trying to call me. I'm sorry about that. Am I clearer now? Because I'm tethering from my phone. So
Yes, you are clear.
a call just came in. So that might have interrupted my internet connection. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, but I hope you get the point that browsers can only display fonts that are installed on the user's machine. So usijifurahishe na kutumia fancy fonts. Don't do that. Okay, now font names that feature white spaces must be placed in quotes. So you can see here, font family. So if the font family has a name, more than one name, then they have to be put in quotes. Otherwise, we also have another font family called Vedana and another one called sans serif. So if it has more than one name, then you have to put them in quotes like that. Now the last choice in the list should always be a generic font family, meaning a common one, a common font family. So that's what the font family property is used for. Other font properties include the font size property, which is used to specify the size of the text. Now we have a variety of units that can be used to specify the size of the text. We have pixels, normally written as px. We have point, normally written as pt. We have m, and we have percentage. So this particular example here uses m, 0.8 m. Now m is actually the relative unit of measure based on the browser's default size for the font. So it's a good idea to use m as a unit of measure, as it allows, look here, it allows text to resize across different displays. It allows text to resize across different displays. So for example, when you use pixels, 5 pixels, then the font size cannot change. It cannot resize. Similarly, when you use points, when you use percentage, it can also resize, but the relative measure, m. So always use m. So we have other font properties such as font weight, which can have values such as bold, etc. So have a look at it. Then also font style that can have things like italicize or something. So also have a look at these other font properties from w3schools.com. The next properties of the text properties we're going to look at is the box properties. As I told you, everything in your HTML, the CSS is going to view it as a box, as a rectangle. Every element in your HTML, CSS is going to view it as a box. Now, the box has a number of properties. One of those properties, of course, is the height. So really, this is the height. Then the next one is the width. This is the width. Then we have the margin. Oh, let me talk about the border first. Border. So this is the border. The border. Then we have margin. Margin is the gap around the outside of the element. Normally the margin is used to separate one element from another element. So for example, if your paragraph is too close to your heading, you can increase the margin so that it can push down the paragraph. So that is what you call the margin. Then another important one is the padding, this one. So here is the margin, this one. Here is the margin. So margin, space between the border and the next element, really. Then padding on the other hand is here, space between the content and the border. So if you've included a border for example, your heading 1, and the border is too close to the content is welcome to Cascading style sheets. So if the border is too close to the content, then you need to increase the padding. Area between the element content and the border is what we call the padding. Please don't confuse between padding and margin. So those are the box properties. So for example, we can define these rules for our heading ones that have an ID value of, for our heading 1 that has, not heading ones, but heading 1 that has, because it's only a single one. We are using an ID here. So for the heading 1 that has an ID value of welcome, we want to specify the following box properties. This box property, border style, can have the value dotted, meaning that we want it to have a border, and the border should not be solid. The other one is solid. Solid is a continuous border, so it has a line that is continuous. Dotted means exactly that. The line has been broken, like you saw in the previous paragraph. Then we want the border color to be red. You saw it on the previous one. Then we want margin, space between the border and the next element. We want it to be 20 pixels. Then we want the padding. We want the padding to be 50 pixels. We want the padding to be 50 pixels. Space between padding, space between the content and the border. Then we want the width to be 500 pixels. So box properties can be targeted by CSS. Margin, border, and padding can be specified also for particular sides of the elements. So you see, you can use padding top 10 pixels. So we just want to affect the top padding. This one. We want the top padding to be the distance between the border and this content. We want it to be 10 pixels. The lower one, it can be the default. So you can be able to do that to change the padding on the top. You can also change the padding on the bottom, so padding bottom. Or padding on the left, padding left. Padding on the right, this side, padding right. So similarly, you can change margin top, margin bottom, margin right, margin left. Okay. Then an important property, the float property. The float property is used to position the element to the left or to the right of your page. An element can be floated only horizontally, meaning the float property is just used to move an element either to the left or the right. So that's what you say. It's used to position elements horizontally. So let's look at this example. We are saying here that for a paragraph, we want it to have a background color of light blue. We want it to have a font size of 30 pixels. We want it to have a font weight. This must be a mistake. So that's just supposed to be a hyphen. We want the font weight to be bold. We want it to have a bold. So that is what you're seeing here. The font size, bold, background, light blue. So this is your browser. This is your browser here. This is your browser, sorry. This is your browser. Okay, so now the other thing we want to do here is we are selecting these selector img is used to select an image. We want to float an image to the right, and we want it to occupy 30% of the width. So this is the paragraph and this is the image. So we've floated the image to the right. So this is the right of your browser. The right of your browser, and it's 30% of the width is on. And that is the image. So that is what the float property is used for. Okay. So block and inline elements. CSS treats block and inline elements differently. So by default, box for block level elements extend to the width of the browser window. So block level elements will occupy the entire 100% of the width of the window. Now, the box, on the other hand, for inline elements only stretches as wide as the element itself. We cannot set the width or the height of inline elements. So I hope you're getting the difference between these two. So if we have a paragraph, then this paragraph is going to occupy 100% of the width. Now, if we have an M in between the paragraph, embedded in the paragraph, then because the M is an inline element, it's gonna span the width depending on the content that it encloses. So it can only go as far. It can only go as far as the content it has enclosed. So that's another difference between block and inline elements. Okay, so you can see here, for example, we have H1 M. So if we have an M inside a H1, we want it to have a border style of solid continuous borderline, and we want it to be colored blue. So that's what we're having here. Okay. Okay, so in case we want to be able okay, so we can make inline elements behave like block level elements using the display property. So this is the display property. If we want to format inline elements like block level elements, then we can use display block. So this is especially useful when we want to make navigation bars from list elements. So we are going to see how to make the top menu using the list elements. Now, the display property can also have the value of none. We normally use this to hide elements. If there are elements that we don't want to show, then we can hide them by using the CSS property display, and we give it the value of none. So when we do that, then any M, for example, that is inside a H1 will not be displayed. It will be hidden. But that is not a good example of how we use it. Normally, for example, we use it to hide, for example, the submit button. So we don't want to show the submit button until all the values of the form are filled. So when we detect, we can use JavaScript to do that. When we detect that all the values have been filled, then we can show it. So we can change. By using JavaScript, you can be able to change the CSS properties. So you can change from display none to display block. And now the submit button will be shown, and the user can be able to submit the form. So that's a good example of how we use the hide. Okay. Specifying color. You can specify color in one of three ways. One of them is by using the color name. We've been using this in like all the other examples, like color red, color blue, color light blue. So that's what we call a color name. But you can also use what you call an RGB value. An RGB value. RGB value normally is specified like this. So the red value, the green value, and the blue value. So color full colon RGB parentheses, then you give those three values. You can also use a hexadecimal RGB value. So for example, hashtag 99CCFF. Then we have image editing applications that you can use to discover the RGB values. But we also have tools online that can give you the RGB values of particular colors. Just Google. You just Google HTML color codes. HTML color codes. Let me see if I can show you that. So HTML color codes, like that. So when you Google that, you're gonna get them. You're gonna get all the colors that you want. Initially, students get very excited. They get very excited with the with the colors, and they want to use all colors of the rainbow. I'm warning you against that. Please don't do that. Your website should generally have consistent colors with the brand colors of the organization to which you're building that website for. Normally, this is derived from the organization logo. Most logos normally don't have more than 3 colors. So your theme should encompass these colors and not all colors from the rainbow. So for example, here you see, if I click the different parts, you can see the hexadecimal values of those colors I'm getting here. So I can just click here and then I copy it. Then I use it in my CSS. So you can drag down, you can click on different shades of purple. So you can either use hexadecimal, you can use RGB, you can copy this, or you can actually use HSL. I can't remember exactly what it means. Hue, saturation, and lightness values. Hue, saturation, and lightness. So you can also use HSL. So please pick interesting colors. We're also going to learn about contrast. That you're supposed to use colors that contrast well, so that users cannot struggle to view your content. Okay. Efficient CSS. Okay, so external CSS files can quickly become very large. So managing this particular external CSS can be difficult. But we have techniques for making CSS efficient and easy to manage. One of them is use multiple selectors where possible. You remember H1, P, so that if we want to color both of them red, then we just we group them together. Then number 2, use inheritance where possible. So we know what inheritance is. We want everything, every text. We want every text in our web page to be colored red. Then we don't have to say H1 color red. No, just say body color red. Then everything within your body, where your H1 and your P's are going to be, they're going to be colored red. So that's what we call inheritance. Then also use Css comments. Use Css comments to separate and explain CSS rules. We do CSS comments just like in C and in C++ programs. So for multi-line comments, you can use that / asterisk and then the comment, then for asterisk and then closing /. If you want a single line comment, then you use that. So single line comment. Otherwise, it's also advisable that you arrange the properties in alphabetical order. So you can see that this property begins with letter B. So it should come before this one that begins with letter P in alphabetical order. So again, that helps your code to be more readable. We can easily scroll down to where we have the P's. So that is just another agreed way of writing CSS code. In programming, this normally is called a convention, programming convention, that we've agreed as programmers that you're going to do it this way. Otherwise, that is what separates the professionals from the quacks. So if you're a quack, then you just write CSS code without following this particular style, which is arranging them in alphabetical order. Okay, accessibility. We're going to be learning about accessibility a lot. Now, HTML only specifies the structure. We already know that. Now, the other thing is that users can actually be able to switch off CSS. They can even define their own. Style sheet. So I want you to research on how to switch off CSS of a particular page. Now, CSS offers an our style sheet. Our style sheet define how the document should sound when read out. So when we say that users can be able to change their CSS, for example, here, if I'm here on this, I can come to inspect. I can right click there, and then I click on inspect. Excuse me. Inspect like that, and then let me see. So we have this div. I can click here. Excuse me. I think I need to take some water. Let me see. Inherited from. I want to see how I can change, for example, the background color. You see the background color here. It was inherited from the body. So I can change this to red. So you see, if I change it to red, it changes. You can see that it has changed to red. So users can be able to do that. They can be able to change it. So HTML and CSS, they're called front end, and even JavaScript, because they're executed on the user side. And that's why people can be able to change that. Okay, so that was just an example. Okay, so the media attribute is an important one that is used for accessibility. Normally it uses the link element. So it specifies the different style sheets for different output. So for example, print.css style sheet will be used if the user prints the page. Some examples of media attributes also include aural, braille, and handheld. Now, we can have different style sheets for different things. So, for example, we have style.css that is used for screens. So, media, screen. We have print.css for print. So that means that if someone presses Control P if they're on our website, then how that is going to be formatted is going to be different. I think you've even seen this on email. You've seen this probably on email. If, for example, you're on Gmail, so I have this email. You can see how this web page has been structured. But if I click on print, are you seeing that it's a totally different structure? It's a totally different structure. So it doesn't look the same. So how do we format this? We format this using a different CSS external page called print.css. You can name it any other thing. So you can see this structure is different from, it's very different from the other structure. Let me try and find, for example, this one. If I click print, so you can see how it looks like. So it doesn't print this layout with these menus, these icons. No. Simply prints the content. So that is what we call the media attribute allows us to do that. Okay. So an overall style sheet specifies how the document should be read out. For example, you can have font family Jen. We want Jen to read our heading once. So female, stress, 40, richness, 90. I also don't know what these particular properties mean, each one of them specifically, but it just describes how Jen should read our H1s in order to specify actually that it's different from a paragraph or from a H2. So that's why we are having this, so that if a person is not able to see, then they can know from this particular formatting that this is a heading 1, depending on how Jen is reading it. If Jen reads a paragraph, they'll read it, for example, with a different stress, different richness, for example. Okay. So validating CSS, it is not as important to validate CSS like it is to validate HTML, but you still can be able to validate CSS from the w3 org CSS validator. So this allows you to identify the syntax errors and be able to correct them so that your site can be as accessible as possible. Now we have several developer tools. Many browsers provide facilities for us to examine CSS of a web page. That is what I just showed you earlier. So Google Chrome, for example, offers the developer tools. Firefox, Mozilla, you can be able to use Firefox developer tools that are offered on this particular link. Why are these tools important? Why are they important? They're important to you as a web designer because you can be able to learn CSS techniques that have been used in other people's websites. They can also help you to fix problems in your own CSS because you can be able to change CSS on that particular page temporarily and be able to run it to see whether it's giving you what you want to view. So that is what we call the developer tools. So this is also a very important technique as a young web designer. You need to go to Facebook, Gmail, and so on and so forth, right click, then inspect, and find out how they've been able to format that particular element. So which CSS have they used? So you can be able to see that as I showed you earlier. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of this particular topic on Introduction to CSS. I hope you've learned something. Anyone with a question or comment before we move on to the next topic? Okay, so thank you very much. That is the end of this one. Let's break for 10 minutes. We meet back at 8:40 for the second part of this class. Thank you very much.